Today on Market Journal, we're almost into July and some field work is still being done. We'll offer some strategies for producers who are planting soybeans late. Have high feed prices got you feeling low? We'll look at some alternatives for fattening up your cattle. And learn about some research focusing on growing corn in saturated soils. What do the findings mean for this soggy season? This week's edition of Market Journal starts right now.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.
Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine.
Hey everyone, I'm Troy Moling and thanks for joining us today on Market Journal. Glad you could be with us. It's the last show of June. We're going to make it a good one. And starting off the broadcast, according to the latest crop progress report, 96% of soybeans in Nebraska have been planted. So yeah, we're getting there. However, for those who haven't planted or have poor stands that need replanting, there are some strategies to consider. Nebraska Extension's Aaron Nygren says you might need to change your soybean maturity group.
You know, if we stick with our full maturities or sometimes even hear people say go later maturity, we really run into the risk of getting frost damage. So by shortening up just a little bit, we make sure that we're going to mature the crop. We don't want to go so short though that we're going to give up a lot of yield potential, because that's our big challenge now. Is yield potential is definitely reduced with this late of planting.
Aaron also recommends narrower row spacing to allow for as much sunlight as possible. And when it comes to seeding rate, stick with what works for you.
A lot of times you'll hear people say, increase your seeding rate with late planting, which sometimes people say it might help. It's just a matter of, especially if we're switching to a drill, we should increase, because drills usually have a poor seed spacing, so that would help make up for that. But if we're using a planter, we may be fine sticking with our normal seeding rate. It's just whatever's kind of comfortable for that farmer.
And if you've already planted and your soil has a high clay content, you might be seeing soil crusting. That has the potential to damage an emerging plant.
For most of the state, we do have a lot of irrigation. The easiest way is turn the center pivot on. If we run some water, that's going to help. Otherwise, if you're not irrigated, then they're down to, sometimes you'll hear people try a rotary hoe, even running the planter shallow right across. Or the last thing is just hope for a rain. That's the easiest way to fix it. Soybeans also, they can break one cotyledon off and it really doesn't seem to harm yield at all. They break both of them off and they're going to be slow to develop, but even then sometimes they still will continue to develop and actually put out a plant. So they're very tough little creatures.
We've posted more information for late planting and soybean crusting on the Market Journal website. That's marketjournal.unl.edu. Moving on, and an unusually wet spring coupled with delayed planting has opened the door for a particularly problematic weed to pop up across many fields. Marestail is one of the more common weeds in Nebraska, infesting roughly 2 million acres in the eastern part of the state. To make matters worse, glyphosate-resistant Marestail is very widespread. It can be a tricky weed to control in soybeans, but there are some steps you can take.
For example, if growers they have planted dicamba-resistant soybean, then they can use dicamba post-emergence to control Marestail. And they also have to follow all the dicamba requirements. For example, they cannot apply dicamba after 45 days of planting soybeans. So there is a cutoff date that they have to consider. If growers have Liberty-linked soybean, then they can use glyphosate-based herbicide, for example, Liberty post-emergence, and they have to use it before soybean will start flowering. So there is also a cutoff date.
And even though yield loss in corn isn't as high as it is with soybeans, growers need to stay vigilant.
If it is early season corn with less than 1 feet tall, then they can use some early post-emergence herbicides like Acuron or Resicor will be effective for controlling Marestail. Plus, if corn is taller than 1 feet, then they can use even dicamba-based herbicides that are labeled in corn. For example, Diflex Duo, Clarity, Status kind of herbicides.
Amit also says the smaller the mare's tail, the easier it is to control. Research that's been conducted shows that 80% of the mare's tail in Nebraska emerges in the fall, so light tillage or a burn-down herbicide may be an option before planting. And again, we've posted more information about this topic on the Market Journal website. Time now for our weekly market segment, and our analyst will be here in just a second. The weather is a big driver for this market. We'll take a look at that. Higher corn prices mean higher feed costs. Are there any corn substitutes you can consider? And what does the latest cattle on feed report tell us? We'll check the numbers. Dr. Josh Maples is our guest this week. He's an assistant professor and livestock extension economist with Mississippi State University. Josh, thanks for being here.
Absolutely, happy to join you.
And let's look at that cattle on feed report to start off. Anything surprise you with those numbers?
There really weren't a lot of surprises in this particular report. You look at the total numbers, the one that got the headlines, 11.7 million head of cattle on feed. This is up about 1.5% above year-ago levels. But again, that was pretty well anticipated. The placements number was down a little bit. We were thinking that was going to happen coming into this report. It's not really a story about lower placements more than a story about larger placements in March and April. And then that May of 2018 number that we're comparing this year to was a really big number. So that 3% decline in placements really tells us more about what we're comparing to than this year in particular. Marketings were up about 1%, so we needed that boost. That was well anticipated, but it was a nice boost, and we hope to see that continue in the coming months. But overall, the report was not a big market mover, not a big surprise to what traders were expecting.
Could you give us an update on what we're seeing when it comes to corn prices? Because that's playing a big role when it comes to feed costs.
Yeah, absolutely. We are in a corn market for sure, and specifically it's a weather market. So if you look at what corn prices have done really since the first week or two of May, we've seen 70, 80 cent bump in December futures. There's just a whole lot of uncertainty about how much corn farmers are actually going to produce this year, and weather is dominating all of this. And so this is, kind of spilling over into cattle markets. There's a very clear link between higher corn prices and lower cattle prices, or at least feeder cattle prices, because the cost of gain goes up. And so we're in a situation where there's a lot of uncertainty in the corn markets that's spilling over into our cattle markets, and it's really put a lot of uncertainty into what our cattle prices are doing. We've seen cattle prices drop significantly the last 6 weeks. Some of that seasonality, but a big part of that is just this uncertainty about what corn prices are going to do.
And I've read where some folks are even suggesting feed substitutes could be an option. Any recommendations on that?
Yeah, so that's absolutely true this year. Anytime you see a primary ingredient price go up like corn is for cattle producers, you're going to see producers look to other options. And a lot of that's going to be regional, Troy. It's going to depend on what kind of feedstuffs are available in your area. And so we're going to see producers start looking to maybe some surplus items around them or some surplus feedstuffs around them to try to substitute for corn. And really the big one this year is just going to be grazing, though. Pasture conditions are phenomenal, generally speaking. We've had really wet spring, and it's led to really green grass throughout most of the country. So I think we're in a situation where we're going to see a lot of producers look at what calf prices are, look at what cattle prices are in general, and say, I've still got a lot of good pasture out here. I think I'll just keep them on pasture a little bit longer. And so I think that's going to be the biggest substitute, is we're going to see calves stay out on pasture longer this year, and probably lead to some heavier placement weights into the feedlot down the road.
What would be the pros and cons of selling the animals at a lower weight?
Yes, that's certainly an option. You can sell them at a lower weight so that you don't have to tack on the gain to them using a higher cost feed. Higher cost feed if corn is a primary ingredient. The big con to that is that the person who would potentially buy that animal from you is also thinking the same thing. And so those calf prices are getting pushed down significantly because the next person along who might take on that animal and add weight to them is thinking, hey, I'm also going to have to take on these higher costs. So the con is that prices are going to be really low for that animal, especially for the mid-weight feeders, looking at trying to add weight to those animals. And that's, again, a reason I think we're going to see a lot of cattle spend more time out on pasture for as long as we have these good pasture conditions.
And Josh, before we let you go, anything on the marketing front or risk management side that we haven't talked about that you'd like to mention for us today?
So risk management is a hot topic right now. You know, unfortunately on the cattle side, there's not a lot of clear wins in terms of what you should do for risk management. And that's primarily because prices have already been beat down so far over the last few weeks. There's not a lot of prices too far out in the future that you're going to look at and say, yeah, I want to lock that in. Really, the risk management side is on the input side. So if your production, especially for feedlots that are heavily dependent on corn, you know, really now and the past few weeks have been the time to look at where corn prices are and where your potential future feed costs are and think about trying to lock something in if it makes sense for you. We've got the acreage report coming up next week, the USDA acreage report. This is going to shed a lot of light on corn production, so that has the big potential to be a market mover. So risk management, you know, either before or after then is going to be a big topic.
All right, Dr. Josh Maples from Mississippi State University. Always a pleasure catching up with you. We'll do it again soon.
Thanks, Troy. Good catching up with you.
Sticking with the topic of cattle and meat, and alternative meat or fake meat is something catching the attention of producers. Now, fake meat can be plant-based, where pea protein is the primary ingredient, or it can be lab-grown, where it's produced from the cells of an animal. And even though some may deem the meat to be fake, the money it's generating is very real. I was recently joined by Nebraska Cattlemen Executive Vice President Pete McClymont to learn how producers are responding.
Obviously, we've seen in 2000 when the dairy industry tried to petition FDA to protect their nomenclature, milk and milk products, as we saw others like almond milk essentially steal, if you will, that terminology to promote their product. They petitioned FDA. FDA stood silent, and it wasn't until 2018 FDA admitted they made a mistake, and so we as a state association as well as nationally with NCBA are working very hard and vigorously with FDA and USDA to define who can have the control on those names and titles. And so we're hopeful. It's off to a decent start, but we're going to make sure we're engaged because producers don't need to have the things that are near and dear to them, the simple terms that define our products, being stolen by people that want to threaten our industry.
A story we'll continue to track here on Market Journal. Hey, what do you say we do some trivia now? And it's a good one. According to the Nebraska Department of Agriculture, Nebraska has ranked as high as 10th in the nation for potato production. So we want to know about how much of Nebraska's potato harvest is processed into potato chips. Is the answer 25%, 33%, 46%, or is it 55%? Make your selection and I'll have the answer after Al's forecast. Moving on, and as Scott Olson often says, I've learned more about the river than I ever wanted. You see, Olson has farmed along the Missouri River bottom in Burke County for 20 years, but some of the most challenging years have come just in the last decade. Having been through two major flood events in 2011 and this year, Olson has become all too familiar with the recovery process after flooding. And with the growing season underway, Olson and others along the river have fields that weren't planted because of flooding and the erosion that comes with it. You can read about steps involved in recovering flooded fields like those on Olson's farm in the July Nebraska Farmer. And it's time now for weather with Nebraska Extension Ag Climatologist and Market Journal Chief Meteorologist Al Dutcher. Al, can we call this week a scorcher? What are we looking like heading into July?
Well, Troy, you're exactly right. We did see some of the heat build in. I wouldn't call it scorching temperatures, but we certainly started to see some above normal temperatures. And really we have to go back to June 4th through the 8th to see a similar period where we've seen well above normal temperatures. This one is going to be, that period was basically in the upper 80s to the low 90s. Now we're dealing with mid 90s to the low 100s. So we're jumping our temperatures up 5 to 10 degrees over that earlier period, and we're going to be dealing with much more significant dew point temperatures, which is going to make things rather sticky. So I kind of look at it as sort of that same type of thing that we see in the fall when we get that first big surge of cold air. It feels miserable. You get accustomed to it and it's not nearly as bad. So we're not exactly looking at a widespread big heat wave, but we are definitely looking at well above normal temperatures, and we should start to see some moderation of these temperatures as we get into the early part of next week. So as we look at the upper air pattern, what we can notice is the center of the high pressure ridge bringing this heat is sitting right over eastern Nebraska. Very light flow in the atmosphere, so it's going to be a very warm, sticky day with not a lot of movement of the air. You can see high pressure pretty much dominating the region, although we do have a surface low to our southwest. There's really no moisture to feed into this with that high pressure, keeping the atmosphere stable above. And then as we go into tomorrow, we'll see a slight movement of that trough to the west to the east. That will still keep us rather warm, well above normal. We'll still be looking at mid 90s to low 100s, depending on where you are in the state, particularly the warmer you are to the south. Not much in the way of any precipitation, maybe a few scattered isolated thunderstorms in the panhandle, but more importantly, as we get into the day, Sunday night into Monday, we see this little wave moving through the region, and that may spark off some thunderstorm activity, particularly in the panhandle. And basically, wherever this convergence zone between the cooler air to our north and to the warm air to our south is where we'll see thunderstorms. Right now, it's depicted across northern Nebraska. This will start to materialize and move toward the east as the week progresses, so we're going to have increasing chances of thunderstorm activity, particularly as we get into the day on Tuesday, as that front starts to sag a little bit more into central and southern Nebraska. We could probably see some widespread precipitation, and then that front basically moves off to our east, the trough digs in, and we'll start to see much cooler conditions across the northeastern part of the state as high pressure starts to build in, but we are still going to be dealing with precipitation, particularly as the front sags across the southern part of the state. So we do have those chances for thunderstorm activity, and then as we get toward the end of the week, we are looking at yet another wave trying to make its way across the northern plains with high pressure starting to build into the western United States. It's going to start to push some of that warmer area into our region, so we're going to start to see a warm up as we get toward the end of the week as the main activity for thunderstorms really moves toward our south. And so as we go into the day on Friday, we see much cooler conditions to the east, warming conditions starting to redevelop in the western high plains, including Nebraska, and a return back to widespread 90s across the region with just an isolated thunderstorm activity. The big question going forward is, will we start to see this ridge again reflatten back out, or is it going to build back toward the north? And that's the million-dollar question. The models are all over the place on it right now, and the latest runs are bringing a little bit cooler conditions in as we go into late next weekend. So the 8 to 14-day forecast reflecting this colder air moving into our region from the west. It looks like the cold core of that will be all along the Rocky Mountains, and that should induce some convection along the Front Range with still a snowpack holding on in the central Rockies. And in terms of precipitation, as those systems move across the northern plains and tapping that moisture from what's left over from the snowpack, we should see widespread above normal precipitation. Although we're not expecting any one day to be excessively rainfall, we will see continuous rainfall events. So Troy, it looks like warm this weekend, then a cooling trend with wetter conditions as we go through the middle of next week.
Thanks, Al. Back to trivia now, and this week we asked, how much of Nebraska's potato harvest is processed into potato chips? The answer is B, 33%. So where does the rest go? It's reserved for grocery stores and seed potatoes. Next up, planting season has definitely been a challenge for many producers this year. And with planting for corn and soybeans almost complete here in the state, Market Journal's Bill Dodd is reflecting on the circumstances of this year's planting season, as well as taking a look at research into growing corn in saturated soils. Bill, tell us what you've got your eye on this week.
Thanks, Troy. Now, dealing with waterlogged fields has been a problem in the state and the Corn Belt in general. In fact, on a recent road trip, Extension Cropping Systems agronomist Dr. Roger Elmore described the scene along Interstate 80 across Iowa into north-central Illinois as one of the worst crops he'd seen in nearly 40 years of driving the same route. Now, he did mention, however, that while Nebraska fields aren't looking fantastic, in comparison to many fields in neighboring states, things could be worse here. Now, either way, producers here are still facing a few problems of their own. With corn planting at near completion in the Cornhusker State, according to the USDA NASS report for Nebraska crops, corn conditions were most recently rated at 1% very poor, 3% poor, 19% fair, 66% good, and 11% excellent. Emerged corn was around 95%, and that's down from the 100% average this time of year. Similarly, soybeans were 96% planted, also behind, but closer to the 99% yearly average, with crop conditions rated at 0% very poor, 3% poor, 22% fair, 68% good, and 7% excellent, with emergence at 85%. And that's well behind this 96% yearly average. I recently spoke with Tyler Williams, who explained despite producers' best efforts, the conditions for optimal planting just didn't arrive this year.
The weather and planting and how it works together in Nebraska is always a story. No matter what, there's always a story that comes out of planting in Nebraska weather. This year, the wetness when we came into the spring, the wetness that continued through the spring, and then now as we start rolling into the summer, definitely played a huge role in planting progress, and it's clear it's all across the country. The extra precipitation that came in the month of May probably was the worst timing for it. We were actually relatively dry in April, but we were so cold, it just wouldn't warm up, so people were waiting for the soil temperatures to warm up. The timing of that and the right temperature makes a big difference, especially in corn, on the emergence rate and emergence timing. So you want to wait for the conditions to be right and best. It's the same story all across the Corn Belt, that window of opportunity never came. So certainly the weather delayed planting, and I think we'll start to see some, maybe some impacts on root development of people trying to push the limits of when was ideal planting and when wasn't. And you basically this year you had not ideal planting or no planting, so there really wasn't a window for ideal planting conditions.
Now, with so many reports of water standing on several planted acres due to such a soggy planting season, many producers are beginning to inquire about the impacts of saturated soil and puddling water on planted or emerging corn. A recent study in conjunction with Mississippi State University and the University of Missouri subjected 8 commercial hybrids to 14 to 21 days of waterlogged conditions with the corn at V2 development. Now, they did find that the plants that did survive flooding conditions will show new leaf growth within about 3 to 5 days with favorable temperatures. Researchers also found that while shoot and root biomass decreased significantly along with chlorophyll readings, water tolerance did vary among each of the hybrids. If you were in a situation this spring where you had to push the limits of planting and you're currently thinking of replanting, Nebraska Extension Cropping Systems Agronomist Dr. Roger Elmore explains at this point in the season, that's probably not the most advisable course of action.
Flooding is not a good situation. We aren't talking about rice here, whether we're talking corn or soybeans. It's not rice. They can't tolerate that flooding. There's a downside to that. It's pretty significant. Basically, if it dries off enough to replant, that was an option earlier on, but we're talking the middle to late June now, so that really is questionable whether that's a wise practice or not, for corn especially. Plant growth is a function of temperature, so the warmer the soil, the warmer the air, the faster crops like corn and soybeans grow. With cooler soil temperatures, that slows down the whole process, and you get delayed emergence, delayed early season development.
In fact, looking into the future may be your best course of action at this point. For instance, figuring out how to change drainage patterns from fields that were greatly impacted by flooding for future planting seasons. For now, though, we got a first-hand look from Roger at the problems waterlogged corn plants from the Havelock test field here in Lincoln have been having.
Well, these plants were from the same row, so the same hybrid planted the same time. The one on the left there, the small one, was sitting in flooded soils for a period of time. I'm not exactly sure how long, but you can see it is stunted. If you look at the root systems, they're quite a bit shallower and not nearly as vigorous. The whole plant is smaller, the stem is smaller. The leaf numbers are, there's about 1 or 2 less leaves on the small plant than on the right one. So it slowed down development. The internodes are shorter, and basically the small plant will be difficult to produce very much, certainly not on the caliber of the large plant. Any emergence, 4 days will basically stifle all the emergence. So this plant probably was emerged when it was flooded, but it was flooded for long enough that it will not recover.
Now, with nearly all our corn and soy in the ground, it seems the worst may be behind us. However, it is a long season and things are just getting started. Just keep in mind a lot can happen between now and harvest. And with that being said, for now, I'll send it back to you, Troy.
Thanks, Bill. Great information there. So if you would like to read more on Dr. Elmore's research reviews, you can find that and much, much more at cropwatch.unl.edu. For our final story today, you may recall back in March we spoke with University of Nebraska ag economist Jim Jansen about the preliminary findings of the annual Farm Real Estate Report. Now the final report is out. This final version provides additional details on land values and cash rental rates and information regarding actual land sales. Last year, 50% of the land sales in Nebraska were cash purchases.
We keep track of a lot of those different historical matters in addition to who is selling land. The majority of the sales, over around half, were estate sales of various kinds in the state, which makes a big difference given the family dynamics of the operations we see in Nebraska.
And as far as how this information helps farmers in making decisions for their business, Jim says there's always lots of interest in taking a look at farmers' finances and how it relates to how we're financing debt.
We may be borrowing money against the equity in our land. How does the value of that compare over time? A lot of folks, especially if they farmed back in the 80s, you get a little nervous when things start declining. We've seen a gradual decline over time. Over the last half decade in Nebraska, we've seen roughly a 20% decline in the market value of the all land average value of agricultural land. And we've seen a gradual decline there. Many producers are finding rental rates as a continued challenge they face in their farm finances when we're in a period of lower commodity prices for maybe our row crops or livestock. So making prudent decisions, prudent negotiations on these topics remain very important for many operators across the state of Nebraska.
This year's report also includes a section regarding the distribution of cover crops and how it compares to the state's cropland. We've posted a link to the report on marketjournal.unl.edu. That's going to do it for this week's show. If you missed a story, be sure and download the Market Journal mobile app or follow us on social media to join in on the conversation. Next week, Chad Hart will be our market analyst. Plus, we'll share some advice on keeping your cattle healthy this summer, which includes controlling flies and preventing foot rot. Hope to see you right back here next time. I'm Troy Moling. Thanks for watching.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.